Hi everyone, thank you for logging on with us today. We're just going to wait a few more moments to allow for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Senior Analysts Chris Antlitz and Michael Soper will be discussing Webscales big to drive new internet connections in cloud businesses. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, our survey, and social sharing. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a replay link as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Chris to begin the webinar.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about some key findings from our recent Webscale ICT Market Landscape. And my name's Chris Antlitz, and that's my picture there, and my colleague Mike Soper. Hi. Hello. He's going to be speaking later in the presentation. So before we jump into the content, I do just want to give an overview of TBR, especially the telecom practice and what we cover. It kind of frames up the content area we're going to be talking about, which is the Webscale space. So we cover the telecom vendor and operator ecosystems globally, and we have a variety of reports that cover those markets, ranging from individual vendor reports to vendor benchmarks to variety of telecom operators, cable operators, and then also benchmarks covering that space as well. And then we have market research where we look at specific technology areas that are highly in demand, big buzzword areas, so think 5G, Webscale is another one, NFV, SDN, these are just a few of the areas that we also cover. And we're going to be talking about some of those areas on this call too, because as we're going to see, some of the Webscales are also partaking in some of these domains within the network space. So with that, we'll jump right in and with the key findings. So ICT capex spend among the Super 7 Webscales. So let me just put a frame up here. We're going to be talking exclusively about the Super 7 Webscales on this call. So the Super 7 are the 7 largest Webscale companies in the world. And on that list is Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Microsoft, Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu. So those are the 7 companies we're specifically going to be talking about on this call and showing spend data for and spend forecasts. So the Super 7, what we see this year is a major ramp in capex spend. Collectively, we're looking at an 85% year-over-year growth in capex, in ICT capex among those 7 Webscales. And there are 2 main drivers of that. The first main driver is the build-out of these global cloud empires. So what AWS is doing, Google Cloud, Microsoft with their cloud ambitions. We've also got the Chinese players, Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent are also heavily investing in clouds and building out cloud points of presence all around the world. We're going to talk about some of those things in more depth in upcoming slides, but that's a big driver. Tens of billions of dollars a year is getting plowed into the build-out of data center facilities globally. The second big spend driver this year is security, and it's particularly regulatory compliance. So we've seen in the news this, the Facebook fake news, what happened there. We've seen similar issues arise for other players in the social media ecosystem, and there is an effort underway for regulators to try and police those companies in a more holistic way and make sure that there is some checks and balances in the market. The other thing is governments are trying to protect end user privacy. And when we look at Europe, GDPR, that's a key driver of the spend here, because what happens is the Webscales that have cloud businesses had to comply with GDPR, and that wound up driving an additional spend on the application layer. So building advanced security platforms that they can embed in their digital platforms, and also in their cloud ecosystems, making sure there is enhanced security there and making sure that there's data residency. So if you're in the EU, you need to have data in certain countries to be in compliance with GDPR, and that pushed the industry to increase capex spend to comply with that. And then third point here is Alibaba Cloud. We did want to talk about Alibaba Cloud because they did a big lift in capex, and what we see is, we all know they're they're very synonymous with Amazon. They're the Chinese version of Amazon, and they try to mimic the business models as closely as possible and adapt it for their particular market, which being China. What we see Alibaba Cloud doing is rapidly building out their cloud ecosystem. So as some of their other businesses start to slow in terms of growth, and slow is a relative term, by the way, still growing at a double-digit rate. But when you have a cloud business that's doubling year over year, that is very attractive to the top line. And from a scale perspective, as they attain economies of scale, from a bottom line perspective as well. As we all know, AWS drives the vast majority of Amazon's profits. It's not the e-commerce business. We do expect that to become a similar trend for Alibaba as well as some of the other Chinese players like Tencent and Baidu. So we talked about the capex lift. Let's look at some numbers. So in 2022, we expect $123 billion to be spent in total capex. That is ICT plus other capex. Other capex is, think the warehouses, the physical infrastructure, as well as the virtual infrastructure required to run the e-commerce business of these companies, as well as other non-ICT endeavors like real estate purchases, office space, furniture to staff these offices with. All of those things would be in the other capex bucket. ICT capex includes the data centers, so the physical hardware, the software, the application stack that runs behind the ad tech layers of these networks, the video-related endeavors by these companies, the technology stack that is required for those video plays. So like YouTube as an example, there's a whole technology stack behind that is scaled globally to support that business. And all of that type of spend is included in the ICT capex bucket. And what we see happening here is you can see the big ramp from 2017 where it was around $45 billion in capex among the Super 7. This year, we're going to see that number attain $80 billion. That's almost doubling the capex spend. This is a huge opportunity for vendors that are struggling to grow within their existing telco accounts. And, this is a huge growth driver for some of these companies. I'll give a couple as an example. Ciena, Juniper over the past couple of years, not as much recently, but if we go back in time, Webscales were a big driver to their top line. And, this is becoming a big focus area for a lot of the incumbent OEMs. And then what we see is the lift this year is not going to stop. It's going to continue to grow. And the continued growth is the requirement for supporting some of the new initiatives that we're seeing coming out, the digital first type plays that these companies are engaging in. So let me give you a few examples here. The cloud business requires ongoing capacity build to map to demand. As we all know, there is a sustained huge shift, migration of workloads from traditional on-premise and or private cloud environments into the public cloud space. And that requires a massive investment in capacity. So building out data centers globally is great, and that helps follow the sun with the customers and having the workloads residing in areas where latencies are optimized, quality of service is optimized, but now they need to start densifying the cloud environments so that they can ensure they have enough capacity to meet the demand. So that's going to be ongoing. The other thing is video. As we all know, video is rapidly growing. We see OTT streaming services like Netflix, the minutes of use continues to skyrocket, and the build out of how many subscribers are on those networks. There's a capacity requirement for that as well as a geographic requirement, right? For latencies, you don't want too much buffering. You have to cache the content closer to the end user. As these companies embark on international expansion strategies, they need to expand the CDNs, and they need to embed more capacity in those systems. So there is significant billions and billions of dollars of investment that needs to still happen further out on this forecast curve just to map to the demand curves that we're seeing for these web-scale businesses. One last thing here, that's where the raw spend is driving, but there's also other initiatives going on here that don't quite drive the needle as much, but they're very important to the long-term evolution of these web-scale companies. So AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, building these capabilities into the platforms that these companies have is extremely important to build efficiency, to optimize the capacity that they have, that they're able to work with, and to enhance the overall quality of experience to the end user. So investments in all those areas are widespread among these Super 7. They're all tinkering with technologies in those areas. All the big buzzwords we hear about, they're all doing it. There is significant money also flowing into those initiatives. Okay, so now we're going to talk about each of the Super 7. We're going to start with Alphabet. So what we have on the right side of each of these slides is the cloud footprint, and we have the list out of where all the cloud locations are. The green tick marks are where the data center is fully operational. The yellow tick marks are data centers that are in process. They're being built out. They're not full commercially ready yet, but they're in build-out phase right now. So Alphabet, lots going on there. So we've seen Alphabet experiment with a lot of different technologies in the networking space. So a lot of these fall under the access division. So we've seen Google Fiber, we've seen WebPass. Both of those initiatives have kind of come to pass in a way, but the learnings from those initiatives are very critical for driving those companies forward. So basically what Google's doing is they're experimenting with how do we bridge the digital divide. This is a challenge that all the Webscales are grappling with in their own way. Why does this matter to them, right? We've got over 5 billion people around the world that have access to connectivity and have access to these Webscales. Well, there's a couple billion people that have no access to these Webscales, and that's the people that they're trying to bring connectivity to so that they can have more of an addressable market to sell advertisements to. So look at what Facebook's doing with Reliance Jio in India, for example, right? There's well over 1 billion people in India. That's a huge market that they can sell advertisements to, right? It's a emerging market from a retail perspective, from an advertising perspective. There is a lot of runway that can be built there to continue to grow these web-scale businesses, these advertising businesses at a double-digit rate. The problem is, and the missing link to realizing that future is, they got to figure out the connectivity. And relying on the telcos to do it is it's a longer-term play. They need to accelerate and facilitate the build-out of these networks globally. They need to reduce the cost points to building out the infrastructure required for these networks. And they need to facilitate ecosystem partnerships to build out these ecosystems so that digital can come into these emerging markets and these companies can continue to grow at the rates that they're accustomed to. So, fiber was a failure. The WebPass, it remains to be seen what happens there, but they've dramatically reduced investment there. But I will say this, Google is increasing investment in other access-related initiatives, Loon being one of them. Loon is becoming much more viable for the company. It's moved from their moonshot, quote-unquote, big bets into more of a formalized business unit. And they're starting to partner with companies like Kenya. So with respect to Telecom Kenya, what Google's doing there, it's called Project Link. And essentially what it is, it's a project that Google started, I think it's 2 years ago now. And what they're doing is building out a metro fiber line around major cities in certain countries in Africa. I believe they're doing Uganda, Kenya, and I forget the third one. But the point is that they are building out the infrastructure, so they're building out the core network, and then they are partnering with local ISPs to splice in actually bringing the connectivity into the last mile. This is a model that Google's experimenting with, and they are hoping that this type of model will, lead to other type. They're trying to see what experiments are going to work and what's going to stick. And let's go to Facebook now. Amazon. So Amazon is all about cloud, right? We talked about Google. We talked about the initiatives they have in the connectivity space. With Amazon, it's all about AWS and building out the cloud empire. So as you can see on the map here, we have all of the tick marks show the different locations of the data centers. And the point I want to make here is that they continue to build out these cloud availability centers. And they've been adding some in Asia, they've been adding some in the Middle East, and they're also adding more in Europe and in the States. Most of the capex spend you see there, all that growth is very much tied to the build out of AWS. So this year it was about GDPR compliance in Europe. That drove a lot of spend. In subsequent years, it's going to be more about adding capacity to support the customers in these other markets, especially enterprises in these particular regions. So let's talk about Facebook now. Facebook's interesting. I'm going to spend a little bit more time here talking about them. So Facebook is dabbling in a variety of different areas, especially in the connectivity space. So similar to Google, Facebook is also spearheading some experiments looking at how to bridge the digital divide. So specifically, they've got the Terragraph program, which is a subset of the TIP, which is the Telecom Infra Project. They've also got the OCP, which is the Open Compute Project. And essentially, those two initiatives are overseen by Facebook. And the point of them is to change the economics of providing connectivity in the world. So, for instance, Terragraph is looking at using millimeter wave spectrum, like 60 gigahertz spectrum, and looking at leveraging microwave type technologies to provide wireless PON for the last mile. So it's basically going over the top of traditional fixed broadband access and going over the top with a wireless play, high capacity, high bandwidth, play here, high speeds to provide to the end users in a kind of a wireless meshed network. So that's the type of architecture they're trying to use there. And, they're working with the ecosystem to build this out. They're working with chip makers, they're working with traditional vendors, they're working with operators, and these are global initiatives. Facebook is also looking at using Wi-Fi. So they have their Wi-Fi Express initiative, and they're doing this in places like India, so emerging markets, looking at how to bring Wi-Fi connectivity as another experiment in these markets and getting people onto the networks. One example of what they're doing in India is they're working very closely with Reliance Jio. And for those of you who don't know, Reliance Jio has their own branded smartphones that they bring out to their market, and they're low-cost smartphones. Well, they're partnering with Facebook to optimize the user experience on those devices, on those Jio-branded devices. And they have a very tight cooperative partnership there. And the whole point is to get hundreds of millions of Indians access to smartphones and access to the internet, and at a low cost. So this is another example of an experimentation type program that Facebook is actively pursuing to try and bridge that digital divide. A lot of the capex spend that you see there, so Facebook doesn't have an outbound cloud business, it's all internal cloud, so all those data center tick marks are for their own business to support the social media empire that they have, the Instagram, WhatsApp, all of those properties. A lot of the spend lift there is related to security. So as you know, they had some security challenges over the last year with the Cambridge Analytica, and then they had the fake news problem. So a lot of that spend lift is them investing in algorithms, investing in security augmentation to make sure that they can eliminate those challenges and make sure that they build the security into the network to make sure that they're in compliance with government regulations and that they can avoid getting into these situations going forward. And bear with us as we transition to the next slide. Hang on, the slides are being a little slow, so we're going to just wait a couple more seconds. It's going to transition. Okay, so Microsoft. So Microsoft, we're not going to spend too much time here, but they have a highly distributed cloud. They leverage colo partners like Equinix to build out, to add capacity to their system and to quickly scale out, build out their cloud footprint. They do own and control some of their own data centers, but they do leverage the colo model quite more extensively than AWS and Google do. So the key points I want to make here is, Microsoft, their spend's actually going to go down next year. They did a big lift this year for GDPR compliance. Next year, we do expect the spend to tick lower, but the long-term average is going to be positive. And as you can see there, they're building out some data centers in the emerging markets in MEA in particular. And with that, we're going to transition to the next provider. Just bear with us as the slides transition. So while we're waiting for the slide to transition, that second bullet point there, AI and IoT, those are two areas that Microsoft is also actively investing in, as are the other Webscales. These are critical for evolving their businesses and using best practices on technology to get better outcomes. So, okay, here's the slide change. So now we're going to talk about the China-based Webscales, and I put all three of them in one slide. So we have Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. As you can see, across the board growth in capex spend, not only in ICT but also other capex. These companies are mimicking what their U.S. counterparts are doing, and we're seeing them investing in areas like AI, machine learning, like we just were talking about. That's across the board. They're also building out their cloud businesses. They're extending internationally. So going outside of China now, we're seeing them building data centers in emerging markets, in developed markets in Europe, in the States, even building out those cloud businesses to support their MNC customers that seek to go international. The other big thing here is evolution of their core business. So when you think about ICT in the instance of Alibaba, this is also about enhancing the retail experience and leveraging things like artificial intelligence, advanced algorithms to build out those platforms for e-commerce businesses. So that is all kind of coalesces. So the convergence between ICT and the technologies, and then converging that with more of a traditional retail experience. That center point there, that convergence of the two, is another area that they're investing in. I don't know if you've looked at Alibaba lately, but they've been merging those two in their retail businesses. So if you go to China, they have some storefronts, some brick and mortar storefronts where you can see like contactless billing. They leverage analytics on the people that are coming into the store, looking at purchase decisions and buyer behavior to try and optimize the user experience inside the brick and mortar locations. So this is another example of leveraging ICT for their core businesses, as well as augmenting their more technologically centric businesses in the cloud sphere. So we're going to transition slides now. And just hang on while the slides transition here. So we've talked about the Super 7, and now we're going to transition to talking about the vendors. So vendor key trends. And for the vendors, there's a few things that we want to talk about here. First off is that there is a change in how these Webscales are procuring infrastructure. And I would view these companies as at the cutting edge of leveraging new approaches toward the architecture. So let's talk about ODMs. So ODMs are your traditional box, the people that put the boxes together, and they own the foundries. They are the ones that actually build the physical boxes that go into these environments. So these are companies in Asia that typically supply the OEMs like the Ciscos, the Nokias of the world. What we're seeing is the Webscales are bypassing the middlemen, which would be the OEMs, and they're going straight to the ODMs and sourcing custom-built boxes at their specs. So they're custom specs, and the ODMs are tailor-making these boxes at high volumes to support the Webscale needs. So literally, the Webscales will send people to Asia, to an ODM, and they'll say, I want 10,000 servers at these specs, and I want you to drop ship them here. And literally, the ODMs will produce that. under a contractual arrangement. So this is a huge threat to the OEMs, and it's also a low margin business. So it's by cutting out the middlemen, they're significantly reducing the cost of the infrastructure. And this is a direct threat. And we mentioned Cisco here. This is impacting the IT guys in particular because we've already seen the virtualization trend play out in the IT sphere. Dell, EMC, HPE, IBM that got impacted by this years back. So this has been playing out for a while now. Now we're going to start seeing it come into the networking space. We are seeing the OEMs fighting back. So Cisco has been mitigating the threat with acquisitions as well as entrenching itself in customer accounts. So building into the roadmap, making sure that they lock in those customers into the virtualization of their networks. So locking them into the Cisco ecosystem, making it more difficult for them to get out and go full ODM from an architectural standpoint. Cisco's also been leveraging litigation. They've sued Arista, who, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the litigation, but the idea was that Arista had been using some Cisco IP and some patents from Cisco, and that they were going after them about that. But again, it's another example that points to this threat that's going on in the market where the OEMs are trying to fight back and compete against the ODMs that these Webscales are going straight to. The second thing here is Huawei. So Huawei's been joining Webscales. They're actually building out their own cloud. So they actually own and operate their own cloud now, not only in China, but also in international markets. And what they're doing is they're selling their own public cloud services, and they are basically becoming, in some respects, a Webscale provider from a cloud perspective. So this is another model that some of the OEMs are taking. And then thirdly here, we've got some vendors capitalizing on the services that the Webscales require. So ODMs are very good at mass producing hardware. They are not good at the services. So they don't have dedicated services teams that go and install, integrate, manage these hardware environments. That's an opportunity for the OEMs who happen to do that to do more of this work for the Webscales. So the Webscales don't really have people on site that do these things, that do the services life cycle, especially the installation of the hardware. They tend to rely on subcontractors or the OEMs to do the build-outs. And this is an opportunity for the OEMs to stay relevant here and take a portion of that services life cycle and monetize the Webscales beyond just the box, but looking at it from more of a holistic solution where, okay, you buy our box, we might charge a little bit less for that box, but we're going to make up some of that margin on the services capture we can get from the more broad solution that we're selling you. So it's not just the installation, but it also extends to integration. It extends to the support of that infrastructure. This is another area the ODMs don't really play in. So who's going to deal with repair and exchange? Who's going to deal with aligning with SLAs? This is a critical area that the OEMs can outcompete the ODMs. So we're going to change slides now, and just bear with us as the slide makes its transition. We're going to keep looking at the vendor landscape. In the next slide, we're going to look at a 2x2 where we plotted some of the vendors to kind of graphically represent what we're talking about here and look at some of the shifts that we're seeing in the market. So here's the slide. So it's vendor positioning, and what we did here is we extended out on a 2x2 how the vendor landscape looks. So we have a mix of OEMs, we have ODMs represented on this slide. And I'm going to walk you through some of the things that to keep in mind here. So on the y-axis, it's relative opportunities to sell into Webscale companies. So it's broadness of portfolio. It takes into account And on the x-axis, it looks at exposure to Webscale companies. So what % of revenue is derived from the Webscale customer segment? And that's how we plotted these companies. Some of the things I want everybody to walk away with here is Nokia. According to our research, Nokia is leading this space. So even though they're an OEM and they're facing the same disruption, they are winning share. So as an example, they have at least 5 that we're aware of accounts here of the Super 7 that they sell optical transport infrastructure to, mostly for DCI. So that's data center interconnect. And that's a big business for them. They're trying to break into the routing layer. That's been a little bit more challenging, especially as some of these Webscales have their own custom specs for routing, the routing layer. Also, some companies like Arista and Juniper have some pretty strong share there in the routing and the switch layer, mostly in the switch layer though, not as much in the routing layer. Huawei is, they have the broadest portfolio. They have the most opportunities to sell into the Webscales, mostly the Chinese Webscales though. The US Webscales, there might be some national security considerations there, especially as companies like AWS have some pretty high profile government contracts in the cloud space. So, those are some of the OEMs to keep an eye on. They're doing a lot. Juniper, Ciena, Infinera, they're also, providing, in Juniper's case, the switching architecture, that infrastructure. Ciena and Infinera, it's optical. Transport is mostly what they're selling. It's mostly DCI and long-haul transport, long-haul optics. And then I want to talk about the ODMs. So on the top left-hand quadrant, you see a list of ODMs there. So Supermicro, Celestica, Quanta, Acton. These are some of the players that you got to keep an eye on. These are the guys that are winning significant contracts with these Webscales, supporting their IT whiteboxing, and also now moving into the networking space with optics and looking at, routing, switching, UCPE. These are all areas that they are actively supporting the Webscales in. Okay, so that was the content for this presentation. And with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A.
Looks like we don't have any questions right now, but if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to the team or also email webinars@tbri.com and also check out our website for a list of upcoming webinars. Thank you for joining and have a great day.